The only countries in the world larger than Brazil are Russia, Canada, China, and the United States of America. However, if you do not include Alaska, Brazil is larger than the 48 contiguous United States. It is the largest country in South America with over 192 million people. It is the only Portuguese-speaking country in the Americas and the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world. It borders all other South American countries except Ecuador and Chile. Christopher Columbus has been formally credited with discovering the Americas in 1492. In 1500, the Portuguese noble, military commander, navigator, and explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral has been credited with the discovery of Brazil. This was likely the first flag of Brazil. After Napoleon invaded Portugal, Brazil ceased to be a colony to become the see of the Portuguese Empire when the capital was transferred from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro in 1808. Independence from Portugal was achieved in 1822. A military coup in 1889 proclaimed a republic, keeping the bicameral legislature of the empire, which now was called the Congress, inspired by its American neighbor to the north. The current constitution was formulated in 1988 and defines Brazil as a federal republic with 26 states and a federal district in Brasilia, the capital. When Álvares Cabral arrived in Brazil, native tribes amounted to about 2.5 million people, virtually unchanged since the Stone Age. Until 1930, the Brazilian economy relied mostly on the production of sugar, gold, and coffee. Slavery was abolished in 1888. Until that year, about 3 million slaves imported from Africa were the backbone of the labor force. Since 1882 until 1934, about 4.5 million people emigrated from Portugal, Italy, Japan, Spain, and Germany. Only the USA and Argentina accepted more immigrants during that period than Brazil. Most of these European and Japanese immigrants came to work the coffee fields and the textile mills, expanding in the state of São Paulo. The coffee barons showed their wealth by moving into the newly inaugurated Avenida Paulista in the fledgling city of São Paulo, where they built their mansions, importing marble from Italy and fine furniture from France, Germany, and England. The last remaining mansion from that period can still be seen in Avenida Paulista, which has otherwise become the main artery of São Paulo's 20 million strong population, making it the third largest city in the world, according to the United Nations Urbanization Prospects Report 2009. The New York Stock Exchange crash in 1929 caught the United States and Brazil in very different circumstances. The US at the time was a vibrant, emerging industrial power, and Brazil was just beginning its industrialization. American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal and Brazilian President Getúlio Vargas's Estado Novo introduced legislation that gave increased protection to the working masses while courting support from corporations in a manner that showed the extreme political abilities of both American leaders. This mild form of fascism had its extremes in Germany and Italy during the exact same period between 1930 and 1945. During a dinner in November 1936, Roosevelt, in a moment of diplomatic flattery, called Vargas the co-inventor of the New Deal. Vargas's alliance with Roosevelt paid its dividends, for the U.S. granted Brazil a $20 million loan for a large steel mill, which was the basis for continued industrial growth in the country. In return, Vargas supported America's war effort by letting the U.S. Navy install a naval air base in Natal. It became the largest U.S. base outside American territory. Modern Brazilian economic history can be divided into 4 periods that allowed the country to go from a feudal agrarian economy to a modern, world-class industrial power. Some in Brazil have named Vargas, Kubitschek, and Fernando Henrique Cardoso as the greatest Brazilian presidents of all time. Let us name the 3 periods after the presidents that seem to have inspired most Brazilians since 1930. The era of the coffee barons was characterized by 6 principal cycles, each centered on the export of a particular commodity: Brazil wood, livestock, sugar, gold, rubber, and coffee. At the height of each cycle, Brazil led the world in production of that commodity. Even during the post-war era, variations in price and market conditions for coffee largely determined the degree of national prosperity. Vargas took the power away from the coffee barons and put it in the hands of the fledgling industrial aristocracy, while at the same time exploiting his unique form of populism that granted the admiration from the Brazilian populace to this day. Ford do Brasil was founded in 1919, importing the complete Ford Model T and the Ford Model TT truck in kit form for assembly in Brazil. In 1930, General Motors officially opened its first plant in São Caetano do Sul, in what is now the greater São Paulo area. Kubitschek was in office at the time when the world, spearheaded by the United States, was rapidly recovering after the ravages caused by the Great Depression and the Second World War, triggering a period of rapid industrialization for the country. He is credited with moving the capital from Rio to Brasilia. Planning for the city began in 1956 and the official move was in 1960. In 1958, Kubitschek inaugurated the second General Motors factory. Located in the city of São José dos Campos, about 80 kilometers from the city of São Paulo. GM was not alone in São José dos Campos. In 1945, a Brazilian military engineer had founded an aeronautical engineering school, bringing professors from the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the USA to staff its original faculty. In 1955, an Aerospace Research and Development Institute was created, which designed the first Bandeirante airplane, the basis for the foundation of the Brazilian aircraft company Embraer in 1969. Lately, Embraer has become one of the largest aircraft manufacturers in the world by intelligently focusing on specific market segments with high growth potential. As industrial growth and corporate profits increased, the labor movement started making its presence felt in the Brazilian political landscape, and inflation began to mount at alarming rates, with warnings from members of the Brazilian intelligentsia, such as Roberto Campos, a brilliant economist that participated in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. In 1964, the pressure from the left engaged the support of then Brazilian President João Goulart to the point where an imminent communist takeover was feared by the industrial establishment, the military, and the U.S. administration of President Lyndon Johnson. The coup was led by General Castelo Branco. Both Kubitschek and Campos supported the coup. Campos was named to the cabinet of newly elected President Castelo Branco as planning minister. One of Campos's first moves was the control of inflation. During all his public service, Campos was a lonely voice in Congress, fighting waste and deficit spending. Both Campos and Castelo Branco opposed statization of the economy and supported free markets. Unfortunately, the generals that succeeded Castelo Branco increased the presence of the state in the economy of Brazil, which led to rampant inflation in later years. The military dictatorship in Brazil lasted from 1964 until 1985, when a new government was democratically elected. What some called the Brazilian economic miracle took place between 1968 and 1973, when Brazil enjoyed yearly growth rates of 11% in its gross domestic product, abruptly ending in 1973 when the world experienced the shock of the first oil crisis. The setback on Brazilian development was progressively dramatic in the subsequent years, becoming more serious after the second oil crisis of 1979. The import substitution model, which gained momentum with the military in power, and the need to import expensive foreign oil to fuel the economy, were financed with foreign debt, creating a balance of payments crisis in the 80s. A series of inflationary cycles, followed by hyperinflation, permeated the 80s. About the only successful exception to the failed state intervention in the economy was Brazil's national ethanol program, launched in 1975. The 1979 Brazilian Fiat 147 was the first modern automobile capable of running only on ethanol. Brazil is the world's second largest producer of ethanol fuel and the world's largest exporter. Brazil and the United States lead the industrial production of ethanol fuel, accounting together for 88% of the world's production in 2010. In 2010, Brazil produced 30% of the world's ethanol used as fuel. The Brazilian car manufacturing industry developed flexible fuel vehicles that can run on any proportion of gasoline and ethanol. Introduced in the market in 2003, the so-called flex vehicles became a commercial success, reaching a record 92% share of all new cars and light vehicle sales for 2009. We are at the end of the Kubitschek era, and the economical scenario of Brazil is certainly not a rosy one. Brazil's national ethanol program attempted to circumvent the negative effects of the oil crisis in the Brazilian economy. This was an intelligent strategic move. Tactically, however, it was too early, for neither Brazil nor the world was technologically prepared for it. the automotive industry did not have the cars, and the global awareness for sustainable growth had not yet become the motto of the day. It then became yet another government program that had to be paid with deficit spending, which meant either printing money or getting a loan from any of the many international banks much willing to oblige. In either case, the revenge of inflation was around every corner of Brazil's economic street in the 80s. By 1989, Brazil had regained its democracy, had a growing middle class that continued to consume more every year, but its economy was sick with inflation and with a very heavy foreign debt burden. A savior was needed, and it just seemed that Fernando Collor was the ideal candidate for the mission. The Brazilian Northeast is considered to be the birthplace of the country, for it was there that the first Portuguese expedition arrived in 1500 under the command of Pedro Álvares Cabral, settling in Porto Seguro in the present state of Bahia, famous for its hot weather, beautiful beaches, unique folklore, and the city of Salvador, with its carnival, as well as the fact that it was the first seat of government in Brazil. The Northeast was the stage for the first economic activity of the country, with the extraction of Brazil wood, highly valued in Europe to make violin bows. When sugar gained importance, it attracted most of the slave trade in the early years of the colonization. According to a DNA study in 2008, 66% of Brazil has European heritage, followed by 25% African contribution and about 9% Native American. The Northeast is one of the poorest parts of the country, plagued by droughts with devastating effects, causing the exodus of their inhabitants to the more prosperous areas of the southeast and the south of Brazil. It is also a heavy burden for the nation as a whole, with social programs that are awash with corruption and paid for by the industrialized southeast and south. During the early part of the 20th century, immigrants from the Northeast streamed in large amounts to the cities of São Paulo, Curitiba, and Porto Alegre looking for a better life. Fernando Collor was fashionably born in Rio de Janeiro, as any aristocratic member of the ruling Brazilian elite should. But his family has its power base in the state of Alagoas, right in the middle of the Northeast. His main opponent in the 1989 election for president was Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula, born in the state next door in Pernambuco. Lula's family was so poor that he had to leave school after 4th grade and move to São Paulo with his mother and brothers in search of work. Lula and Collor could not have come from more diametrically opposed corners of the Brazilian society. Starting as a shoe shiner in 1957 at age 12, he was a press operator at the time of the military coup in 1964, when his views started moving towards the left. In the 1970s, still under military rule, Lula helped organize major strikes and was in prison for a month. Lula was a founder of the Partido dos Trabalhadores, or Workers' Party, in 1980. His first run for office was in 1982 as candidate for governor of São Paulo. he lost. In 1986, he became a member of Congress with the most votes nationwide. In 1989, Lula ran as the PT candidate in the first democratic elections for president since 1960. At that time, Lula advocated land reform and defaulting on the external debt of Brazil. At the start, Lula was the lead candidate. Collor, coming from behind, gathered support among the nation's elite with a more business-friendly agenda. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 took place just a few days before the presidential election. Some feel it swayed large sections of the middle class away from Lula, whom was viewed as espousing a system that had miserably failed. When Collor won the election, inflation was running at 84% per month. How could things get so bad? Whose fault was it? To answer us, Campos might well rise from his grave and say, "I told you so. There is too much government interference in the Brazilian economy." Collor probably subscribed to that view. Unprecedented revolution. This is how some have qualified the actions taken by Collor during his short term in office. For he pushed privatization, opened the Brazilian markets to free trade, encouraged industrial modernization, stopped the import substitution model, and implemented public debt reduction. Collor privatized 15 different companies, amongst which the state-owned giant steel company, Acesita, founded during the Vargas era. In order to stop inflation in its tracks, he ordered the freezing of all bank accounts for 18 months and declared a freeze on all prices and wages. Inflation subsided, but later came back with a vengeance. When he was forced out of office in 1992 for alleged corruption, inflation was more than 1,000% per year. 2 years after he left office, inflation topped 2,500% per year. The savior had become the villain, and the multitudes, particularly the young, were asking for his impeachment. Collor resigned shortly before being impeached and was replaced by Vice President Franco, whom appointed Fernando Henrique Cardoso as his finance minister. And with this, we enter the Cardoso era.